Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. For those of you who don't know me, I am Evrim Işık. I work as research assistant at the Department of English Language and Literature at Yaşar University, and I'll be moderating Dr. Francesca Cauchi's talk today. Before she begins, please let me introduce Dr. Cauchi to you in her own words. Dr. Cauchi thinks of herself as, at best, a scholar gypsy and at worst, a lost and peripatetic soul. Upon receipt of her PhD in 1994, she took up her first academic post at the American University of Beirut. Shortly thereafter, she embarked on a world tour of far-flung and, in her own words, far from illustrious universities, teaching in northern Lebanon, northern Cyprus, Chile, Malaysia, Iraq, and Palestine. As you can see, she is currently ensconced here at Yaşar, and today she's going to present a paper on the first of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, Burnt Norton. The title of her talk is Romantic Scepticism and the Descent into Nihilism in T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton. So, Francesca.
Thanks, Evrim.
Scholar gypsy and the lost and peripatetic soul. We'll be talking about nihilism, right? Okay.
That's right. Yeah, a subject close to my heart. Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for attending my talk this evening. I'm going to begin with a preemptive strike to try and disarm my critics. So I'd like to begin by stating I am not an Eliot scholar, nor am I I'm not an expert in the modernist period. So I speak as an outsider, not as an initiate. This really isn't my my professional field. But my area, as most people know, my area of specialization is the long 19th century. And it is therefore probably inevitable that as the texts that are most familiar to me are those of the Romantic period and of the English Romantic poets in particular, then it's not surprising that those works do tend to inform my reading of post-1840 literary works. So to paraphrase a line from Nietzsche, surprise, surprise, it is a paraphrase. I can't remember which text it comes from. One gets out of a work only what one puts into it. In other words, our reading of any work of literature is ineluctably colored not only by our personal experience and our affective propensities, but also, and more importantly, by the works which have formed our intellectual landscape. For example, when teaching Tennyson's poem Ulysses last week, I was struck by the echoes, one might almost say the direct borrowings from Shakespeare's Henry V, and also from Byron's very long poem, Childe Harold, both works with which I'm intimately familiar. Were I a classicist, however, I would doubtless hear Homeric or Virgilian-esque echoes in my engagements with literary texts. So the reason I'm saying this is because my focus today is on the Romantics and the Romantic echoes that I personally hear when I engaged with the text Burnt Norton. But two people that are fairly familiar with my work, both of whom are, one of whom's a Dante scholar, another David who teaches Dante, have both impressed upon me the indelible impress of Dante's Divine Comedy on Eliot's work. However, this is an impress on account of my unfamiliarity with Dante, but I remain to this day largely ignorant. So you have to realize that my interpretation of this text is very much colored by my area of expertise. And so talking about coloring and colored, I will share, I'm going to present the introduction to the paper, and then I'm going to share my screen in which you will find the text, excuse me, that we're going to deal with today. And because it's a close reading, I've tried to facilitate it by color coding the different passages. And I'm looking at these passages as different narrative voices that I hear when I heard when I first read Burnt Norton. And so what I'm going to do, these color coding is meant to function as a kind of Ariadne-like thread to lead you through the labyrinth of my rather dense prose. It's very hard to follow a dense argument in a presentation, which is why I will share the screen and I will tell you what color we're up to in case you get lost. Okay, so as I said, all I'm going to do in this paper, I am going to close read the first movement of the first quartet. But I'm not going any further. So what you see on the screen is what I'm going to be dealing with. And I'm going to begin my paper with an abstract, with the abstract to the paper that I originally wrote. I did write this paper several years ago. And then I'm going to follow that with a brief quotation from F.R. Leavis's landmark text, The Living Principle. And then I'm going to lead into my close reading, at which point I will, if I can manage it with technology, I will share my screen. Okay, so the abstract to this paper is as follows. The nihilism consequent upon the First World War, and which T.S. Eliot's four quartets sought in some measure to dispel, emerges in Burnt Norton, the first of the four quartets, as the chilling culmination of a putatively redemptive idealism. In common with his romantic forebears, and in particular Wordsworth and Coleridge, the ambivalent narrator of Eliot's first quartet harbors a desire, so I'm claiming, to transcend the limits of temporality through the positing of an ideal world that he, however, suspects may be illusory. The result, I argue, not in this paper, but in the second half of the paper, which you won't be listening to, the result is, and what I see in the second and third movements of Burnt Norton, is a descent into nihilism, which is as extreme as it is absolute. A nihilism which Nietzsche 50 years earlier had decried as a, quote, a will to nothingness, unquote. All right, so that's the abstract. And now a very brief quotation from F.R. Leavis. And actually, when you write a paper, you have to do a lot of secondary source reading. And it was only after I wrote my paper that I discovered this quote from Leavis. And it is remarkably apposite given my focus in the paper that I'm going to present today. And F.R. Leavis says, the explorations which the four quartets, which this text proposes for itself. Now, he's trying to tell us what he thinks Eliot is trying to do in the four quartets. So according to Leavis, what the four quartets proposes for itself mean plunging deep into regions of the equivocal and the delicacies of apprehension and divination. And this plunging deep into the regions of the equivocal necessarily involves special hazards and temptations. I'm not dealing with the temptations, but I am dealing with the equivocations in the text. Okay, so, or the regions of the equivocal and the apprehension. There's a lot of elusiveness. To be honest, I wrote this text and I found it so frustrating. I still find it very frustrating. I find it unnecessarily complex. Well, unnecessarily complex. I don't feel that as a reader you can hang on to anything at all in the first movement. It's so elusive, and its elusiveness makes it very elusive. All right, and it's also the elusiveness is also, and the elusiveness is there too for the narrator of the text of the first movement of Burnt Norton. Okay, so I'm now going to proceed with the introduction to the essays to give you a context, this romantic context, which is of course where I'm coming from, and then I will upload the text on my screen. I will share my screen, and then I'm going to close read it along with all the colors. Okay, so I'm now going to start. T.S. Eliot's notorious denunciation of the English Romantic poets with their liberal humanist values and their poetics of emotional subjectivity needs no rehearsal here. The virulence of his attack, however, does not preclude facets of a romantic rehearsal, of a romantic sensibility and a romantic propensity appearing in his own work. As Louis Menon astutely observes, quote, Eliot built his castle out of the stones he found lying around the yard of modernity, just as Wordsworth, Emerson, Arnold, and Pater had built theirs. In other words, what he's saying here is that, well, I interpret this as the stones that are lying around in the yard of modernity are, of course, the stones of the 19th century, works of the 19th century poets. Indeed, if Eliot is correct in asserting that, quote, the most individual parts of a poet's work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously, that's a quote, of course, from his Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, then evidence within his own work, and this is what I'm trying to show today, I'm trying to show this evidence within his own work of romantic traces which function as markers of a literary tradition and of Eliot's place within that tradition should occasion no surprise. Well, not if you're coming at it from my perspective, clearly not a surprise. One such trace in Burnt Norton, and the core focus of this paper, is the romantic desire to transcend the limits of temporality through the positing of an ideal world or essence, while, however, simultaneously harboring the suspicion that a redemptive ideal is no more than a flight of fancy. A flight, moreover, on a precariously nihilistic trajectory. But we won't be getting around to the nihilistic trajectory. Okay, and now I'm going to give you a brief background of the Romantics association or experience of this elusiveness or this equivocation or this veering towards the ideal, but always at the same time suspecting it as an ideal. And we have both Wordsworth, we have Wordsworth in this, we have Coleridge, and we have Shelley. All of them are, they all flirt with idealism. And yet in Shelley's Alaska, as I will mention, what happens to the poet, he ends up, he dies, he drowns, just as, rather like Narcissus, peering into the pond or into the lake. We'll get onto that a bit later. So, of the dangerous allure of idealism, both generations of English Romantic poets were acutely aware. To take just two examples, let us briefly revisit Wordsworth's introductory note to his Intimations Ode and Shelley's Alaska, or the Spirit of Solitude. In Wordsworth's Intimations Ode, Wordsworth recounts how as a boy, precociously obsessed with thoughts of mortality, he found solace in biblical stories of Enoch and Elijah and retreated into a solipsistic void so as to facilitate a similar death-eliding translation into immortality. Instead, however, he found himself assailed by resurgent and redoubled fears of non-existence. And this is the quote: I was often unable to think of external things as having external existence, and I communed with all that I saw as something not apart from, but inherent in my own immaterial nature. Many times, and this immaterial nature, I would argue, is what we are dealing with in the whole of the first movement of Burnt Norton. This is a Wordsworth quotation, by the way. Many times while going to school, have I grasped at a wall or a tree to recall myself from this abyss of idealism to reality, to come back to reality. Now, in the second half of my paper, which I won't be dealing with today, I deal with that abyss, which clearly Eliot does go through via a via negativa. He ends up in this nothingness, a sort of mystical Buddhistic oneness, which is also nothingness. Wordsworth's abyss of idealism lies at the didactic heart of Shelley's Alaska, a poem in which the poet protagonist, who is a fictional representation, incidentally, of Wordsworth as a young poet, succumbs to a dream vision of ideal beauty. Upon waking from his dream, and we'll have the same dream, we'll have the same thing, I think, in Burnt Norton, in the first movement. Upon waking from his dream and finding the natural world now viewed in the light of his visionary ideal, this is, I'm discussing here Shelley's poet in his poem. And as I said, I'll be doing the same thing with Eliot's narrator. When he wakes up from his dream of his visionary ideal, what he finds the natural world now viewed in the light of this ideal as cold, as vacant, and devoid of meaning. And upon this, the poet frantically pursues the ideal rather than accepting the reality, and he pursues it to the verge of death and expires in a desperate but skeptical hope of Liebestod. A similar pursuit, I am arguing here, results in a similar nihilistic extreme, and it propels the first three movements of Eliot's Burnt Norton, of which I'm dealing only with the first. Precipitating this flight to idealism is an implacable disenchantment with worldly existence. For the adolescent Wordsworth, it was the spectre of death and mortality, which is why he was flirting with immortality. For Shelley's poet, it was the world's impoverished approximations to knowledge, truth, and virtue. And for Eliot, it was the apocalyptic carnage of the First World War, diabolical confirmation of what he had oxymoronically reviled as, quote, the progressive degradation of an age. That's a quote from one of Eliot's essays. And so he considers the apocalyptic carnage of the First World War was for him diabolical confirmation of the progressive degradation of an age in which, however, he nevertheless felt ineluctably complicit. As he confessed in another essay, The Idea of a Christian Society, which he wrote 4 years after Burnt Norton, this is a quotation, "The feeling which was new and unexpected was a feeling of humiliation." This is the feeling directly after World War I. "It was a feeling of humiliation which seemed to demand an act of personal contrition, of humility, of repentance and amendment. What had happened, i.e. the war, was something in which one was deeply implicated and responsible. It was not, I repeat, a criticism of the government, but a doubt of the validity of a civilization." And so that was the quote. "In the darkness of this guilt, where the canker of the human festers, and where the very term civilization calls into question its normative pretensions, it is in this guilt that nihilism breeds." It was in response to this threat of nihilism, a threat, by the way, which Nietzsche also faces head on in much of his work. In response to this nihilistic threat, Eliot composed his 4 quartets, offering to the shell-shocked European soul consolation, direction, and the prospect of rehabilitation. But as this essay seeks to disclose, the nihilism which the quartet sought in some measure to dispel is reinscribed in a redemptive idealism that drives the Burnt Norton narrator, in common with his romantic forebears, towards a life-denying extreme. In the quartet's first movement, idealism emerges as an innocuous quasi-romantic bent towards a Neoplatonic essence of which visionary flashes appear to afford fleeting glimpses, towards which an ambivalent narrator is simultaneously drawn and skeptical. So you get these visionary flashes, but then they vanish. And we have this narrator expressing his doubt, and we have this speculative voice. However, When we get to the third movement, well, we're not getting to the third movement, but in the third movement, this idealist impulse takes a decisive nihilistic turn, and it translates itself into a form of ascetic or Buddhistic or mystical detachment, which 50 years earlier, Nietzsche had identified as the most dangerous threat of all to European soul. As Nietzsche says, and this is important because it's the suffering and the culpability and the complicity that Eliot felt after the World War. And I believe that it's this suffering that also led him to seek idealist confirmation in the ideal, or in a non-world, in a spiritual presence that is a spectral presence. So Nietzsche says, in the ascetic ideal, which is what I'm accusing of Eliot of in this poem, suffering was interpreted. The enormous ill emptiness seems to be filled by the ascetic ideal, and the door was shut against all suicidal nihilism. This abhorrence of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing for the beyond, and that's what I'm focusing on, this longing for the beyond, away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, desire, and even longing itself. All this means, let us dare grasp it, a will to nothingness, an antipathy to life, a revolt against the most fundamental conditions of life, but it is and it remains a will. It is precisely this longing for the beyond that I believe that in the first quartet, Eliot's romantic ancestors are asserting their immortality most vigorously. Okay, I'm now going to try and share my screen, if I can successfully do that. Okay.
Francesca, I can help if you want.
I think I've got it. Let me just see if I think, let me try it. Share. Yeah, where is it? Here it is. Okay, it should come up.
Yes, it has. Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to take you through, sorry, it's already 5:27. I'll try not to keep you too long. I'm going to take you through this close reading. As you see, I will tell you when we're in the red passage, when we're in the blue, the red, the blue, the mauve, the turquoise, and we go back to the mauve being the romantic. All right. So this is my close reading. I'm sorry, I need some water. Okay. There is something almost willfully abstruse about the desultory first movement of Norton. It's an intransigent obscurity in which the movement's 5 consecutive narrative voices, speculative, circumspect, romantic, detached, and didactic, seem to conspire. This conspiracy lies in the ambivalence of each voice towards the subject of its discourse. So in the first one, we have philosophical musings on time, which are hedged with conditionals, that's red. In the blue, we have a reluctant compulsion to excavate the past. In the mauve, we have the quixotic pursuit of spectral, possibly illusory presences. Then in the turquoise, this is really bizarre. We have a series of flat end-stop lines deployed to describe with the utmost dispassion a moment of illumination. It's really quite extraordinary. And then we end with a bold assertion, which is rendered ambivalent by the semantic ambiguity of the 2 lines. The net effect of these equivocations is a narrative skepticism towards any kind of attempt to redeem or transcend time from a position within time. And yet it is precisely these attempts to transcend time, which preoccupy the narrator in the quartet's first three movements. So we're now going to close read this first section. Narrative ambivalence is immediately apparent in the first movement's opening meditation on time. What we see is a succession of perhaps, if, and might have. They've been boldened and highlighted on the screen. These are subsumed under the movement's only, it's not even a rhyme, it's a near rhyme, abstraction and speculation. These tentative philosophical claims of the first narrative voice seem to be inviting rebuttal from the reader. The first statement, taken as a comment on linear time, is unremarkable, save for its adverbial reservation. So these are the lines. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. But we have this perhaps, which throws everything open. The second dissolves the latent determinism of the first by centering time in the nunc stans, in the always present. But like the first, it's qualified by a conditional. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. Moving on to the third, with its emphasis on the futility of what if might have been, etc., etc. The third, with its emphasis on the futility of what if ruminations, resolves itself into a final statement that holds in precarious balance both an eternal presence and a putative end, and which, depending on how one reads the text, either recuperates the earlier determinism or it hints at a release at time, a release from time's inexorable impress. And so the lines are, what might have been, here we have it here, what might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. So the last two lines, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present, which is reprised at the close of the movement. The speculative rumination ends, it yields to a dogmatic assertion. But again, we have this ambiguity which remains in the telos of what is this one end that's been pointed to? We have no idea. So we have this undisclosed telos of the one end and the unrevealed freight of the present. Does it mean present as in present or present as in now? All right. The one end could be the nunc stans. All right, but that would annul the telos, and it would potentially affirm either immanent being or immanent becoming. Alternatively, it could be an eschatological end, which would give the lie to the earlier philosophical claim that all time is unredeemable. If all time is unredeemable, there is no salvation at the end. There's no eschatology, right? So the word present is also ambiguous. It is, of course, I would say, a self-conscious pun. It denotes both the modality of time, the present, and a spectral presence, that immanent, whether it's immanent or it's transcendent, whether it is intuited or it's just sensed vaguely, it haunts the narrator throughout the remainder of this first movement. So, moving on to the next section, in pursuit of an elusive presence, footfalls echo in the memory, past the road not taken and the door not open towards the rose garden of what might have been, despite the disdain of the first narrative voice towards such speculative exercises. He refers to speculation, but then he takes us into the footfalls echoing in the memory. Upon the threshold of the garden, doubts are raised over the purpose of, quote, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves. And we have this nice sort of assonance going on, quasi-assonance between the disturbing and the disturb in the dust. So again, also sort of a tension there, should we disturb the dust? But by having those two words and the assonance in them, we are already disturbing the dust. So doubts are raised over the purpose of disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves. Doubts which linger in the hesitant enticement of, quote, shall we follow, unquote, only to be swept away by the next line, by the peremptory urgings of a deceptive thrush. And I'm going to quote this, it's on the screen. We're into the mauve section now. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, round the corner, through the first gate, into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world? The siren-like call of the thrush, tempting us towards a noumenal presence, of which, whether origin or end, we have been warned already by the first narrative voice to be leery, not only reinforces the aforementioned skepticism, but it echoes the deceptive voice of two other memorable birds from the 19th century. We have Thomas Hardy's blast beruffled thrush singing above the century's corpse in his poem, The Darkling Thrush. And we also, of course, have Keats's ecstatic nightingale in Ode to a Nightingale, singing of summer in full-throated ease. For while both birds offer momentary relief from desolate despair, the corpse of the 19th century would be buried under the wholesale slaughter of the 20th. And the easy ecstasy of the Nightingale's song would lure the sorrowful poet, i.e. Keats, like his Alastor forebear, towards an ecstasis of easeful death. So this desire for death, which we have in Alastor, and we also, of course, have it in Keats's wonderful Ode to a Nightingale. And as contended above, it was the bloodbath of, as I said at the beginning of the paper, it was the bloodbath of the 20th century, signifying the corpse of what Eliot referred to as the corpse of a civilization, which would lead Eliot and his burnt Norton narrator towards the ecstasy of a quietist world, not world. This is in the third movement, which we're not doing, but he refers to a world, not world, where sense and spirit, guilt and humiliation are finally laid to rest. Okay, let's carry on with our reading of the mauve section, passing through the first gate into our first world. And notice the repetition. I've highlighted all the repetitions and the synonyms for invisible and the sort of allusions to an ideal world. Passing through the first gate into our first world, we are misled by the repetition of first into thinking that the garden into which we are being led and we are about to enter is a pre-lapsarian idyll, the Garden of Eden, of innocence and promise, of course, before Eve seduces Adam, right? But anyway, so we're dealing with the pre-lapsarian, the pre-fall. But however, we are not being led into, that is not the first world that we're being led into. No, instead, we find ourselves amongst dead leaves and enigmatic echoes. And now I'm going to read the lines in the second column here. There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat through the vibrant air. And the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye-beam crossed. For the roses have the look of flowers that are looked at. There they were as our guests, accepted and accepting. One is immediately struck by the difference in tone between the circumspection of the second narrative voice and the wistfulness here of the third in its reflections upon the all-elusive they. The syntax links the pronoun they back to the other echoes that open and impel the first paragraph. But the nature of these echoes and the part they play in the deception of the thrush, of the bird, yes, the thrush, the deception of the thrush, is never disclosed, leaving the reader to draw his or her own inferences and conclusions concerning the hidden relation between the ambiguous echoes and the ambiguities contained, to go back to the beginning, in the one end, which is always present. Do these echoes signify residual traces in the memory of something irretrievably lost, or perhaps as something instinctively yet impossibly yearned for? Or are they oral apparition, something that we hear conjured up by the heat of an autumnal mind, reflecting ruefully upon a lived, unlived past that might perhaps have been otherwise. And we get that in the lines down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened. This is in the blue section, into the rose garden. Whatever their provenance, they resonate with, my argument is, with a peculiarly romantic timbre, as the following comparisons will serve to demonstrate. It's quite late, so I'm not going, I'm going to skip the next paragraph, but in the next paragraph, I draw, I don't think I have enough time, right, Evrim? It's a paragraph. Shall I read the paragraph?
Yes, of course you can. We still have time.
Okay, all right. So these are the echoes that I think, or that I hear, and these are echoes coming from Wordsworth and Coleridge. All right, so this is the romantic echoes that I hear when I read these lines in Burnt Norton. So he refers to the vibrant air, which you can see that I've boldened in the most section. Now, this vibrant air is so central to the romantic, this idea of a romantic, of an intellectual breeze. All right, so these invisible intimations that we hear here in this romantic section in mauve, that are borne upon the vibrant air, carry traces of the one intellectual breeze which Coleridge muses might sweep over the animated world, but then Coleridge dismisses them as idle fantasies, as idle flitting fantasies. And Wordsworth refers to this as a correspondent breeze, a poetic inspiration, which he feels is moving within him, but which then degenerates into a tempest and a redundant energy, which he then, vexing its own creation, unquote, which suggests that his own derision, that he's just invented it. This isn't real, it's not a present, it's his imagination, an overactive imagination. So the creation and tempest are registering the poet's derision and doubt. Hindered intimations hover around the unheard music. This is Eliot, the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery. Now here, immediately this echoes the unheard melodies, and it's quote, we have unheard in the Keats, we have the same word, the unheard melodies in Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, melodies piped by a fair youth beneath trees that will never shed their leaves, because the flowery tale of happy, happy boughs, a happy melodist, and more happy love, of course, is nothing more than Arcadian fancy, a cold pastoral, as Keats would have it, of still life, told by an overly embellished Grecian urn. There are echoes too of Wordsworth's lament for flowers, seen but unseen. These are the flowers here, the roses, right? There are echoes too of Wordsworth's lament for flowers, seen but unseen, because they are unparalleled in celestial light. A light that he too questions and dismisses in his elegiac stanzas, in which he ruefully describes this light as the light that never was on sea or land, the consecration and the poet's dream. And finally, it is exactly the same light seen by the Alastor poet, Shelley's Alastor, the poet protagonist of Alastor, in his dream, and which the poet protagonist, obedient to the light that shone within his soul, lures him on to a dark obliterating course, quote unquote. And it is that dark obliterating course that I argue in the rest of my paper, not the one I'm giving you today, is the same course that Eliot's narrator is bent upon in Burnt Norton. Okay, so I'm moving to the end now. I've nearly got another maybe 5 minutes and we'll be done. So let's go. So to deal with this turquoise section that is really, really extraordinary. And the reason it's extraordinary, it's dealing with a mystical moment. But the mysticism is not sort of, if you think of, there's a lot of mysticism in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, where it's all really sort of quite embellished and Of course, he was ashamed of it later on, embarrassed by it later on. But normally when you get a passage of mysticism, it's very lyrical and it's very emotive. And well, emotive perhaps is meant to be meditative, but it's lyrical. But this isn't. These lines are so dry and abstract and cold. And yet what he's trying to do is trying to convey to us a mystical moment, but then it vanishes. So all the way through this first movement, we get this flirtation with presences, but then a dismissal of them, of nothing but they're probably nothing more than illusory illusions, elusive illusions. All right. So drawn along by these echoes, the vibrant air, the unheard music, and the flowers and the unseen eye beams, drawn along by these echoes, the narrator is led, and now I'm going to read the turquoise bit, in a formal pattern along the empty alley into the box circle to look down into the drained pool, dry the concrete, brown edged. In stark contrast, end of quote. In stark contrast to the richly elusive language of the third narrative voice, or the romantic voice, the fourth is as sparse and as matter of fact as the concrete surroundings that it describes. The formal landscape garden geometry of pattern, box circle, and edged, together with the confined, straightened nature of an alley, suggests design and direction, and a maze-like drift of mind and echo towards a predetermined end point, which takes us back to the beginning of the movement. Here at the end of the alley, the adjectival chain of drained, dry, and brown-edged evokes the earlier image of dust on a bowl of rose leaves, symbolizing perhaps the lumber room of memory and a draining away of vitality in the aridity of autumnal decay. There the bowl, here the box. Sorry, there the bowl, here the box circle. Both figures of enclosure, limiting the scope of recollection to the crabbed purview of age and experience. Boxed into the brown edge memory, and this takes us back, my reading of memory here is going back to the blue passage in the first column here. Boxed into the brown edge memory of what has and might have been, one inevitably finds oneself raking over the dead leaves, quotes unquotes, of the past, retracing steps towards what was once a rose garden of opportunity, but is now a place of desolation and desiccation. Unlike nature's seasonal renewal, the human life cycle of spring, summer, autumn, and winter is a linear succession of ever diminishing possibility, dwindling finally to an empty alley, emptying out onto dry concrete. As dryly observed in the second movement of East Coca, which is the second quartet, quote, it was not what one had expected. In the concrete impact of vacuity, in this concrete alley that we find ourselves, in the concrete impact of vacuity lies the end game of deception. The realization that memory contains no consolation, nor age, understanding, only the fault lines of attrition and loss. And this is another line from the third quartet, the Dry Salvages, quote, there is no end of it, the voiceless wailing, no end to the withering of withered flowers. At this moment, the moment when one finds oneself in the paradoxical darkness of enlightened undeception, the susceptibility to deception is most acute. Hence the potential beguilement of those who, menaced by vacuity, peer into drained pools. And here, I'm nearly finished. We're going back to the turquoise section. And the pool was filled, this is the mystical moment. This is the lotus moment. And the pool was filled with water out of sunlight. And the lotus rose quietly, quietly. The surface glittered out of heart of light. And they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed and the pool was empty. To reiterate, that's the passage. To reiterate, the plain, direct, unemotional diction of the fourth narrative voice is striking. The marked restraint, the controlled composedness of quietly, quietly, and the graceless syndeton and the bird, and the unseen. The graceless Cinderton give the lines an almost reportage-like quality, a quality which encompasses the metaphysical heart of light and lends it quasi-factual status. This rhetorical ploy sets into high relief the romantic echoes in the rose garden. But even here at the edge of the pool, equivocation and subversion intrude in the reference to reflected echoes, suggesting a narcissistic type of delusion already intimated in the earlier line to look down into the drained pool. Thus, what might have been a visionary lotus pond bathed in sunlight might also have been nothing more than a Coleridgean fancy, an epiphenomenon of the mind. And this is my closing paragraph. The unseen I-beam crossed, that's a quotation from the turquoise bit. The unseen I-beam crossed, eclipsed by a passing cloud, the vision vanishes, leaving only the empty pool. Whereupon the narrator, acknowledging that humankind cannot bear very much reality, allows himself to be lured once more by the blackbird into the rose garden, filled now with another kind of echo, for the leaves were, quote, for the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly, containing laughter, unquote. Laughter and excitement, a composite synecdoche of youth, reminiscent yet again of Wordsworth, for whom the child, quote, and this is a Wordsworth quote, haunted forever by the eternal mind, bodies forth, quote, a presence which is not to be put by. So this presence in Wordsworth, which had him clinging to the tree, which I read at the beginning, takes us back to the presence, the eternal presence at the beginning of this movement. In memory's dusty archive of shadowy recollection, the dead leaves that had once crackled under small feet and ringing laughter emblematize a lost presence that nevertheless remains forever present. And just as in the latter stages of his ode, Wordsworth finds in the philosophic mind solace from thoughts of mortality, so the burnt Norton narrator, sensitive to mankind's need for metaphysical comfort, closes the first movement with the same philosophical pronouncement with which he had closed his opening meditation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, unquote. Sorry. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present, unquote. The cumulative effect, however, I've been trying to argue, of these elusive echoes, these fleeting visions, and a duplicitous thrush, and a mythical garden is mounting skepticism towards the one end, which I argue is as ideal as it is ambiguous, and it leads the narrator towards which the narrator is nevertheless being drawn. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for your patience. Sorry, it was a lot longer than I anticipated. Apologies. Thank you.
Francesca, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. This was the last time, sorry, this was the first time I've, read Burnt Norton. And well, I'll have to look up so many words before I can, understand you. So if there are questions or comments, they're all welcome. And thank you again, Francesca. Well, we have a message. Maybe I can read that. Yazan Hidmi. Do you feel that T.S. Eliot, a modernist poet, did a good job in emulating the romantic sentiment? Is he showing, is that your question? Is he showing hope for the modern world and the return to happiness and innocence after war?
No, I don't think he is. Not at all. Not at all. I think for me, the voice that comes through is one of loss. And it's of an older man. Well, I mean, he would have been artificially aged anyway after the First World War and the horrors of the First World War. No, I don't think so, is the answer to that question. And I don't think it gives hope. And the reason why, of course, you have to bear in mind that I was writing, the second half of my essay deals with the other movements. And those movements is a movement away from the world. into a world, not world. It's a movement into a mystical nothing. So, you know, this is the nihilism that, I mean, Schopenhauer also deals with this oneness and the veil of Maya into this other world, and we're only living in a phenomenal world of appearance, and we have to, you know, behind the veil of appearance is this noumenal world, or what Eliot refers to as a presence, something that's eternally present. But in the other movements, he takes us down this via negativa into nothingness. So no, unless you see redemption in a nihilistic withdrawal from the world, from quietism, a Buddhistic quietism. Well, I don't know whether you could say Buddhistic quietism. I think that's oxymoronic, Buddhism quietism. But anyway, if you're going to lead this world into a mystical world, into a non-world, a world that is not world, then I don't see that. It's not a consolation. It's an escape. Well, it isn't, but it's an escape. It's an escape into another world. Yeah. So yes, if you want to have that escape, then it's positive. But it's not in this world. You're in another world. Thanks, Yazan, for your question.
Right. Thank you. Catherine wants to speak. Catherine, you can unmute yourself and say.
Thanks. So I really enjoyed this, both your reading and the poem. I'm very convinced by your reading. I don't know all the romantic intertextuality going on here, but I wanted to ask you something I noticed in the poem, and I wonder if you can take account of it in your reading, is a sort of dialectic sort of, or like, you know, he mentions the call and response going on with the bird and the bird line, and accepted and accepting. And then the, you know, this sort of human beings cannot bear very much reality, but they can bear some, you know, there seems to be some sort of, I just wonder if the descent into nihilism isn't more like a back and forth between nihilism and something else. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, and it's interesting because you talk about a dialectic, sort of like, and there is that, and yes, and also there is this back and forth, and there is this flirting with an idealism, and yet coming back to the present. And as I said, you do have with the pool and this moment of this sort of epiphany. The pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose. The lotus rose quietly, the surface glittered, and then it disappears. So there does seem to be, I think, I end the paper, by the way, by saying that he does remain in reality. He does remain in this world. But yes, I like this idea of maybe a dialectic going on, and I think sort of a flirtation, a withdrawal, and maybe a holding of the two. I mean, one doesn't have to exclude the other. So well, yeah,
I love.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. Finish.
No, I finished.
Well, I'm just so fascinated by this line. The roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. So you have this beauty, but it seems sort of inaccessible. Like roses are beautiful to look at, and we can enjoy and delight in looking at them. But that doesn't seem like we never hear that the roses are looked at, but they have the look of flowers that are, there's a like distancing going on that is fascinating, you know? So I don't know. Yeah, this is great. And I love I don't know. I just wonder, maybe you can work in the sort of whatever's going on with call and response here on some level. Anyway, thank you so much.
No, I think that's really interesting, Catherine. And I mean, I don't know what you make then of the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. What do you make of
although
that?
The objects, the roses, like in themselves, it's not like human beings that are looking at the roses and taking delight in that, but it's something, it's put on the object as like the roses. I don't know. It's weird.
It is. Had the look of roses, of flowers that are looked at. Again, there's almost a sense here. There's almost a sort of intimation here of Narcissus again. You know, Narcissus looking at self in the pool and going into the pool, and as I said, with me with the romantic echoes. But if they have the look of being looked at, there is almost this narcissistic quality that I was trying to bring out also in the looking into the pool. And of course, we don't know what the they are. We've no idea what's moving. They moved, or what's moving. I have no idea. Anyway, yeah, I think it's interesting, your call and response. Nice. I hadn't seen that. Yeah. Oh, there's a million things I haven't seen. I mean, this is just one reading of millions of this movement.
Can I maybe ask a question?
Yes, Trevor, hi.
Okay, hello, thank you. Thank you very, very much for that. I know I've read this in the past, but I was seeing new things and hearing new things as you were talking again, so thank you. I was really struck just now, and actually this is why I decided to leap in, with this question of first worlds and other worlds, right? And I guess the echo that I have going on in my head at the moment is actually Milton, Paradise Lost, right? The world was all before them, where to choose. Now in Milton, in a really interesting way, it's actually the fall, it's exile from paradise, which therefore opens a path to futurity, right? There's this wonderful openness and futurity which comes from the expulsion, whereas the problem here is that from line 3, the future is already contained, right? So I'm wondering actually whether this is so much about a failure of redemption, or rather whether it's about the failure of a fall or the impossibility of a fall. Is it the mourning of the loss of paradise, or is it the mourning of the futurity that comes from the loss of paradise? In other words, is it the mourning of the loss of the narrative of the loss of paradise, if you see what I mean? Because there's a way, right, even towards the end of this section, the echo that we do have is the bird saying, go, 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 as if urging a kind of escape, a flight from this contained garden.
Yeah.
And yet, even that very possibility of a flight or an expulsion, go, 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 is already contained within an echo chamber.
Yes, and also what you're saying is that the future has been foreclosed. It's already foreclosed by saying that at the beginning that it's time present and past is already contained in time future. So there is this foreclosure, as you're saying. So so it's not so much the fall of the. Or you said something about there not being a fall, but this idea of a futurity of the future. But can you repeat that thing that you were saying about the future? The morning of the morning of no future, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a morning of no future.
But it's not a mourning of redemption. It's a mourning of the possibility of a fall. It seems to be almost impossible to fall when even that narrative of fall is already contained within this chain of dry and dusty echoes.
Yeah, and also, I mean, they cannot be, you know, I think also the fact that there is no future and there is no way out, I think that is why in the other movements, there is this concentration in the now, but it's a now that opens not into a garden in the past. He's warning us not to go back into the past, not that the memory, there is no comfort in the memory. So we have the past that is determined the present. There's no point in going through the door that wasn't open. There's no point in going down the path of regret, but there's no future either. And I think in a way, again, this idea of the civilization and what happened after the First World War and what happened in the First World War, and the sense that what future can there be? I mean, what sort of civilized beings, how can we make sense of the word civilized after the First World War? In which case, the only thing is some sort of a mourning of no future, as you say, but then this focus on the eternal present, which we don't know what it is. And is it an eternal presence or an eternal presence? It's interesting. I don't know. I can't make head or tail of any of it. I'm not a fan of Eliot at all, because I find it sort of over intellectualized, and I find it that I know it's sort of not tempting, but it's seductive, because it throws out all these questions and it doesn't resolve them. But then, of course, that's modernist poetry for you. It's not nicely resolved, and you don't have a fixed form. It opens more questions. It throws open more questions. It asks more questions than it answers, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
David wants to ask a question, but before that, Francesca, Yazan Hidmi also asked another question after the first one. So is it a snarky attack on romanticism?
Is it a what text? Snarky?
Snarky attack on romanticism.
Who knows? I don't know, because he was so anti the romantics.
Yeah.
And so is it, I don't know. How do I know? I mean, but you know, one of his readers, if I can quote it for you here, one reader of let me find the quote. I didn't quote it to you because it was a secondary source. But one of them says, the problem with she calls him a romantic. She says, the problem with Eliot, the problem Eliot had with romanticism was the fact that he was a romantic. I can't find it. But I mean, he may well be attacking the romantics, but he may well be, I don't know. But, you know, given that that Eliot was the one that writes about individual tradition and the individual talent, and clearly, and how the dead ancestors speak through your work, whether he likes it or not. I mean, but the purpose of this paper was to show that there were echoes there. Maybe they're subconscious echoes. They may well be subconscious echoes. But whether he's having an attack, whether he's attacking the romantics, who's to say? As I said, I'm not an Eliot scholar, so I wouldn't know. Thanks, Yazan.
Right. Okay, thank you, Francesca. David, please.
Do we really have time for more questions? I want to make sure I don't.
Yes, sure.
Drag things out.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
First of all, Francesca, thanks so much for that. I think your training as a philosopher really helps, especially with the early part of this. I think that this is the part that makes lit people stumble, and then they start getting more comfortable as they make their way through this passage. I do think in that beginning, there's a couple of ways of looking at the kind of implicit determinism that you see in the first part, where everything that happened in the past, whether it's the speculative might have been or the real thing that happened, lead to one end always. It can be the kind of material determinism of the 19th century, you know, a kind of Nietzschean, Darwinian sense. Or it can be that kind of teleological theology that Eliot seems to embrace in the second half of his career when he's producing these poems, which is one of the things that puts him back more in alignment, in my view, with Dante. But like you say, when you read this poem, you inevitably read it through the lens of what you're bringing to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it especially, I think, in the early phases. I would just say one thing about your reading. I think that line about humankind cannot bear very much reality is so key to getting what's going on in this first section. And I don't know where it originally came from, but I know that he stole it from himself, because he uses that line in Murder in the Cathedral. And he puts it in the context of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, and Beckett's place in the world as a kind of almost transcendent figure to him, which he kind of likes. So when I read that, it seems to me the obvious way to read it is the bird says first, come into the garden. And then the bird says, go, 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 you have to leave, because humankind can't bear very much reality. And the thing that happened that was so intense and so brief that it has to be left behind is that second half of your turquoise section, when the light fills that brown pool, and it's no longer dry, empty, brown. It's now lotus, sunlight, and water. And that can't last very long. So when he uses that line, humankind can't bear very much reality, somehow we have to figure out a way to put the idealism that you're talking about together with Eliot's assertion that that is reality. That's the thing you can't take very much of. So you go back to what I think you keep calling the real world, was to this bird, not the real world. I guess the bird, in my view, has to be a a Platonist of some sort who's saying you need to go back into that cave and look at shadows, because when you see the direct thing of the reality, you can't stand it for very long. And that's why we kind of live the lives that we do. And I like the way that you're saying we've got to read this first section in light of what comes later, like the third section of Burnt Norton, and then East Coker, and some of the lines you pulled out of Dry Sauvages. There is all of this stuff that I think you read as nihilism, and I would read as the dark night of the soul, a kind of that via negativa that you were talking about, which, going back to Dante, becomes the other way of getting to the final canto of the Divine Comedy, the vision of the Beatific Vision, which is what I think Eliot gives us at the end of Little Gidding. And I thought it was interesting. You don't take us to the end. I mean, you couldn't in your time you have here. But if you got to the end of Little Gidding and you have these more positive assertions of a redemptive possibility, how would that fit into your reading of the nihilism in this section of the four quartets?
Oh, but
that was a long, terrible question. I'm sorry, but
yeah, but the quartets are so different, and the tenor of each is different, and the mood of each is different, and the moods fluctuate within each move.
Yes.
You know, you have each of the four quartets within which you have the movements. The four movements within each of the quartets, and then each of those movements that have fluctuating moods, or as Catherine pointed out, perhaps this sort of toing and froing and call and response, but they're just so different. And I mean, my reading of the first movement was coloured by the other three movements of, I did restrict myself. Well, I was a bit naughty, of course. I just picked out the things that supported my argument from the Dry Sauvages and from East Coker. But yes, I think, of course, you can also find the positive and the revelatory, which is clearly there. It's clear here in the Lotus. But yes, I'm sure that you would have a much more positive reading of this poem, and that's why I was so happy that you were going to come today, because I know, and also you've got the Dante background. But yeah, I liked your points. So yeah, the bird perhaps is a platonic bird, and going back into the cave. That's really interesting, David. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for that.
Thank you, David. Now we have another question from one of our first year students, Francesca. She says Zehra, her name is Zehra Selim Tunca, and she says that she really likes T.S. Eliot, and she thanks you for the great talk. Her question is, I heard that each quartet refers to one of the four elements. How do we relate Burnt Norton to its element, air?
That's a first year student, my goodness. How do we relate it to air? Well, we have everything in the first movement. We also have water. We have air and we have water. Is she saying that the first Burnt Norton is related to air, the element of air?
Yes, that's what she said.
I don't know.
To its element, air.
Air. Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, we have the vibrant air, but in that vibrant air, we have the bird. We have the bird in the vibrant air, and so it all depends on how you want to interpret the bird, how you want to interpret the vibrant air. I interpret it as an intellectual breeze, as in Wordsworth. As in Coleridge. And no, the intellectual breeze is Wordsworth. I can't remember what. The Aeolian harp was in Coleridge. It all depends on the interpretation. But yes, the air is there. But as I said, but then we've also got the pool. We've also got the water. It's not really water, of course, it's dry. I don't know. I can't answer your question. I don't really know how significant. I didn't know that each one represented an element. So interesting, that would be the air. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I would have to reread it with that perspective. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more intelligent response. Thank you. I can get back to you. I can send you an email perhaps, since you're one of our students.
Right. Thank you, Zeja, and thank you, Francesca. Now we have, well, I think these should be our final questions. We have another question from Philip Cole. So here is the question. Oh, sorry. Okay, here it is. Eliot's East Coker counterpoint the burnt Norton's nihilistic voidness, which Dr. Cauchi ably unpacked. There is a passage in East Coker, the dripping blood our only drink, the bloody flesh our only food, in spite of which we like to think that we are substantial flesh and blood. Again, in spite of that, we call this Friday good. That was a quotation. There is an incarnational aspect of Eliot's Anglo-Catholicism.
Yeah.
What is your comment on this?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of religious resonances, right? So Philip's referring to the Anglo-Catholicism, which we get, of course, much more in his other poems later, because he converted to Catholicism. My memory of, I know he converted to Catholicism, but well, of course, all the blood stuff, that's the blood of Christ. But I have to say that in this section here, I don't see anything that is remotely has any sort of resonance of Anglo-Catholicism or anything particularly Christian. I would be interested if you could tell me if there's anything Christian that comes through, because I don't see that at all. We have that very philosophical first movement, very abstract. We have this idea of words echo, which I feel that we're in the realm of memory. This first world that nobody knows, but it's very suggestive what this first world could be. The dead leaves, the vibrant air, the lotus rose. And again, the lotus isn't Christian. I think you've got the Rosicrucians. I'm not sure what the image there of the Rosicrucians. So yeah, again, I mean, you're asking me a question similar to David's, asking me to you know, sort of, the other quartets are so different, and they're all of them are just massive in themselves. They're an unknown. I mean, I read them, but I focused on this, so I don't know East Coker well enough. But I don't believe that there are any Christian resonances in this first movement by any means, and I'm not even sure there are many in the rest of Norton. But you might be able to correct me there, because you have an ear to the theological. As I said, what we read influences the way we read a text. Anyway, thanks, Philip. Thank you for your question.
Mr. Cole, I think you can speak. You can turn your microphone on and speak if you wish.
It's okay, thank you. She has answered it, and I was resonating with David when he points towards Little Gidding and Dante's figure, and even a gesture towards the road of Emmaus, that stranger, you know, that talks to them. And of course, the text I quoted, maybe this is Lent season, this transubstantiation, the flesh and the bread and the wine of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
There is the Anglo-Catholic trying to break through the nihilism of burnt Norton. Perhaps that's the agony of Mr. Eliot. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that brings us back to, of course, the quote that David brought out, the two lines, that go, 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 said the bird, humankind cannot bear very much reality. And perhaps this notion of the blood, the body and blood of Christ and that sacrifice, I mean, perhaps there's a way of seeing the whole of the First World War as a kind of crucifixion of civilization. You know, the end of civilization as we know it. I mean, it was the Great War, and nothing was ever going to be the same again. And so it can be seen as, you know, and that's the religiosity coming through, and the sense that the horror is so great that how can we call ourselves civilized beings? And so this idea of the dripping blood, that's in his Coker. I don't remember that line. I will fish it out. But yeah, the body and blood of Christ, and But as I said, I don't hear any resonances of the Christian hymn, but perhaps this, the humankind cannot bear very much reality. I don't know.
I mean, just another quick comment, just a very quick one. When I was in Selçuk in Turkey, you know, looking across at Patmos, you think of John the seer and the Apostle John struggling with this whole idea of the Word made flesh, you know, and there's this the dualism of flesh and the spirit, and whether it is possible at all that in the person of Jesus Christ there could be the incarnation of a Word made flesh. And theologians have argued about that, whether it's dualism or is it Gnosticism. These are all history of ideas, intruding into a very good close reading of Bern Norton. So we should not digress too far. Thank you, Francesca.
Thanks, Philip. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Hiba Ganim.
Hiba.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Francesca. Hi. Thank you very much for this brilliant reading. I really enjoyed it. I just had a comment concerning one of the questions that was raised earlier. I think it was by Zahra, and she was talking about air. So there was something that struck me in this reading, and basically in this these passages, the sense of sound. So it is always unheard, echoes. And it somehow relates to what you're reading into it, perhaps. The sense that air is empty medium and it doesn't carry the sound, perhaps the sound of nature, or there is emptiness and space is full of just air that doesn't fulfill the function of even carrying sound of humans. And it depends on the human's ability to receive what is heard. So but I just had these ideas that came to mind in relation, and I was curious if there's any echo of romantic aspect in those through this idea of the sound, the hearing, the air as a medium for basically hearing. So I hope it makes sense.
As a medium for what? As a medium for what?
Carrying sound. So echo as in an empty space, as is there an ear that will receive the sound or not? So all of that, because it refers to death as well, because it's like at death there is no ability to hear, to receive sound, to all of that, and there is no air. So it's just thoughts that came to mind.
Yeah, I mean we've got the vibrant air. So it's vibrant. So the sense is that the air is alive, and it's alive with echoes, but it's not really, because it's unheard. So we've got the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery. So the air, it's vibrant with with echoes, but these are not heard echoes; they're unheard. So he's not, whatever he's hearing, presumably is in his own imagination, right? Or in his, whatever he's reflecting upon. It's the, and also I think the autumn, why the autumn heat? I don't know why it's the autumn heat, which again is also oxymoronic. We don't have autumn heat generally. You know, in autumn we don't associate autumn with heat. So this autumn heat, the vibrant air, but I think I don't know, and we've got the pressure moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat and through the vibrant air. I don't know. I mean, it's whatever you want to identify the bird as. I think the bird is the key, but he won't tell us what the bird is. And so I mean, we need to know what the bird is. We need to know what the garden is in the first world. But that is, I suppose, the point of the poem is to, I don't know, ignite our own thought processes, and it really is a reader response kind of poem. It's not like a sonnet that you can say this means this and this means Shakespeare's talking about this. It's not like that. It's so dense. I only made the sense of it that I could, but as I said, it's so partial. It's partial and it's highly subjective. So yeah, I don't know. Thanks, Hiba. Thank you.
We don't have, I don't think there is another question.
Okay.
So, Francesca, thank you again for this wonderful talk.
Thank you, Evren, for hosting it, so moderating it so well. Thank you, very good with technology. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your patience in attending. I'm sorry it was longer, it should have been half the length. I do apologize, but I really appreciate those of my friends and former students that showed up. I had people from Palestine, from Chile, from Malaysia. And Hiba was my old student from Lebanon who now teaches in Istanbul. So thank you very much and Gizem, of course, who showed up, so from Yashar. So thank you all, thank you very much for attending, and apologies again for the duration. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone,
Francesca.
for joining us
Thanks,
today.
David.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right.
Thank you all.